Good evening, I'm Atlas Morgan, and tonight we have a lot to cover. The conflict in the Middle East is now in its third day, and over the past 24 hours it has widened considerably. What started as coordinated U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran on February 28 has escalated into a multi-front confrontation involving missile and drone attacks across the Persian Gulf, the effective closure of the world's most important oil choke point, and direct hits on American diplomatic facilities. We're going to walk through all of it tonight: the military picture, the economic fallout, and two other major stories you need to know about. Let's get started. We begin with the most provocative development of the day. Two drones struck the United States Embassy compound in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, early this morning. According to the Saudi Defense Ministry, the attack caused a fire and minor structural damage, but no injuries. The embassy was largely empty at the time. The U.S. mission immediately issued shelter-in-place orders for Americans in Riyadh, Jeddah, and Dhahran, and the State Department escalated its guidance to urge all U.S. citizens to immediately depart more than a dozen countries across the Middle East. The drones are believed to be Iranian in origin, part of Tehran's broader retaliatory campaign following the joint U.S.-Israeli operation that began Saturday. Now, the embassy strike didn't occur in isolation. It's part of a much larger Iranian response. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps launched what its defense ministry described as 137 missiles and 209 drones across the UAE and other Gulf states over the weekend. At least 3 people have been killed in the Emirates, 1 in Kuwait and 1 in Bahrain. The attacks have targeted not only military installations but civilian infrastructure, which brings us to the broader Israeli campaign. Israel, for its part, continued its offensive on Sunday with a new wave of heavy strikes on Tehran. Explosions were reported near Azadi Square, Azadi Stadium, and the Milad Tower, the heart of the Iranian capital. The Israeli Defense Forces say they struck the General Staff Headquarters of Iran's Internal Security Forces and the Thar-Rala Command Center. Iranian state media reports that radio and television headquarters were also hit. According to the Iranian Red Crescent, the cumulative death toll in Iran has reached at least 555, with more than 747 injured. Those numbers remain difficult to independently verify given restricted communications inside the country. The single deadliest reported incident so far is the airstrike on a school in the city of Minab, where Iranian state media says 148 people were killed. Washington has acknowledged the strike occurred, but stated the U.S. would not deliberately target a school, and that the circumstances are under review. We should note, the fog of war makes independent verification extremely difficult right now, and casualty figures from both sides should be treated with appropriate caution. Here's one dimension of this conflict that would have been hard to imagine even a few years ago. Amazon Web Services reported Sunday that drone strikes damaged 3 of its data center facilities, 2 in the United Arab Emirates and 1 in Bahrain. The UAE facility caught fire, forcing authorities to cut power to 2 clusters of data centers. Oz described the cause as, quote, objects that struck the data center, unquote, careful not to explicitly name Iran, though the timing leaves little room for alternative explanations. This appears to be the first time a major commercial cloud provider has suffered physical damage from a military conflict. Oz advised customers to consider migrating workloads to other regions. Think about that for a moment: an entire availability zone taken offline not by a software bug or a configuration error, but by a drone. The cloud, it turns out, still has a physical address. TechRadar is calling it, quote, war risk reaches the cloud, unquote. And it raises serious questions about the vulnerability of the digital infrastructure the global economy depends on. The economic consequences of this conflict are arriving fast, and they're arriving through the Strait of Hormuz. For those unfamiliar, the Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway between Iran and Oman through which roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply passes, more than 14 million barrels a day in 2025. It is the single most important choke point in global energy trade. In response to the U.S.-Israeli strikes, Iran's Revolutionary Guard issued warnings prohibiting vessel passage through the strait. That's not just a threat, tankers have been hit. At least 3 vessels were struck near the strait over the weekend, including one off the coast of Oman that was set ablaze. Major shipping lines, including Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd, have suspended all transits. Tanker traffic through the strait has dropped by roughly 70%, with more than 150 ships now anchored outside the waterway waiting. The market response has been immediate. Brent crude jumped as high as $81.89 a barrel in Monday trading, up over 10%. West Texas Intermediate, the U.S. benchmark, climbed 8% to around $72. The national average gasoline price hit $3 per gallon for the first time in 2026, and analysts expect an additional 10 to 30 cents per gallon increase in the coming days, with some stations potentially seeing spikes of up to 85 cents. Secretary of State Marco Rubio addressed the price concerns on Monday, saying, quote, "There is a plan in place. We anticipated this could be an issue, and Secretary Wright and Bessent will begin to roll out those steps starting tomorrow," unquote. Rubio did not specify what those steps entail, but options could include releases from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve or diplomatic efforts to increase production from allies like Saudi Arabia. Now, while the U.S. has some buffer, domestic production has been near record levels, not every country does. India is particularly exposed. About 85% of India's oil is imported, and roughly half of those imports transit through the Strait of Hormuz. As of January, the Middle East accounted for about 55% of India's crude intake, approximately 2.74 million barrels per day, the highest since late 2022, partly because Indian refiners reduced Russian imports under U.S. pressure. Analysts at CNBC noted India faces potential short-term supply crunches, rupee depreciation, and pressure on fiscal balances if the disruption persists. This is not an abstract geopolitical problem for over 1 billion people. It's the cost of cooking fuel and getting to work. Shifting to Europe, where the conflict in the Middle East appears to be accelerating a trend that was already underway. President Emmanuel Macron of France announced today what officials are calling the most significant change in French strategic thinking since 1960. France will increase the size of its nuclear arsenal beyond its current stockpile of roughly 300 warheads, and extend its nuclear deterrence umbrella to European allies for the first time. Here's what that means in practice. 8 European countries, the United Kingdom, Germany, Poland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Greece, Sweden, and Denmark, have agreed to participate in what Macron is calling advanced deterrence. France will allow the temporary deployment of its nuclear-armed aircraft to those 8 nations. Germany, notably, will participate in French nuclear exercises, a development that would have been politically unthinkable even a few years ago. Macron also announced the construction of a new nuclear-armed submarine to be called the Invincible, with a planned launch in 2036. A few important caveats. There is no explicit security guarantee being offered. The decision to use nuclear weapons remains solely with the French president. And this is not NATO nuclear sharing, it's a parallel French-led framework. But the signal is unmistakable. Europe is preparing for the possibility that it may need to provide more of its own security architecture, regardless of what happens with the transatlantic relationship. Coming at a time when the U.S. is actively engaged in a major military operation in the Middle East, the timing of this announcement is not coincidental. Finally tonight, the United States Supreme Court. On Monday evening, the court intervened in New York's redistricting process, blocking a lower court order that would have redrawn the state's 11th congressional district, currently the only Republican-held seat in New York City. The district, which covers Staten Island and part of Brooklyn, is held by Representative Nicole Malliotakis. The background: a New York State trial judge ruled in January that the current district map dilutes the voting power of Black and Latino residents in violation of the state constitution and ordered a redraw. The Supreme Court, over the objections of its 3 liberal justices, granted Republicans' request to pause that order, meaning the 2026 elections will proceed under the existing map. Justice Samuel Alito, writing in support of the decision, called the lower court's order, quote, unadorned racial discrimination. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, in dissent joined by Justices Kagan and Jackson, accused the majority of an quote unexplained about-face from the court's usual practice of staying out of state election litigation. Redistricting is one of those areas where the facts genuinely do support multiple legitimate legal interpretations. Voting rights advocates say the current map suppresses minority representation, while opponents argue the proposed redraw would amount to racial gerrymandering. The case will continue through the courts, but for 2026, the map stands as is. The world is rarely simple, but this week it's being especially blunt about it. Military strikes in Iran, drones hitting embassies and data centers, oil markets in turmoil, Europe rethinking its nuclear posture, and the Supreme Court drawing lines literally. The facts are moving fast. We'll keep following them. I'm Atlas Morgan. Atlas holds the world. Morgan broadcasts it.